So, thank you for your patience. That was a bit longer setup here. Today. So yesterday we talked about, does anyone recall?
Notifications.
Cool. Thought I didn't get anything across, so that's good. Again, for the ones that hadn't been there yesterday, I think most of you were actually. So cloud is getting smaller and smaller. It's very desirable. I like group work. So next week we start with one-to-one sessions. One of the things in terms of the videos last week, the videos were streamed but not listed. So they were streamed as unlisted, but they were in the playlist. So you may not have been getting a notification with respect to new videos. So if you want to catch up with last week's videos, but I think you mostly attended anyway, so I guess it doesn't really apply to you, but they're on the playlist and publicly visible now as well. And so should those ones be here as well. Right, so yesterday we talked about notifications, and the key idea was there, okay, how can we do a bit more sophisticated interaction with the UI, and how can you use notifications to, for example, control parts of your app. For which purpose are notifications probably quite useful? Intuitively, yeah.
For letting the user know if something is happening.
Yep, cool. What else?
If you want to beg the user to rate your app on the...
That's similar along the category there, right? So along the line, so right. So and you have powerful mechanisms of doing that, right? Being a bit annoying, right? So do you recall one of the properties you could set to annoy the user to death?
Is it insistent?
Yes, exactly, right? So the kind of insistent notification that bangs you until you actually interact with this thing, right? So yeah, not clever, but possibly a potential for abuse. What else? What other use case do you see for notifications? Since you're, yeah?
You can use it to control background processes.
Exactly, right? So that's one of the, very good. So that's one of the key things. Last week we talked briefly about processes, right? So one of the characteristics is, irrespective of their priority, they may well run in the foreground, they're generally not visible, right? So they don't have direct UI interaction. And for that purpose, you can actually use notifications to control them. It's of course very specific to the service. They are probably the more sophisticated forms of notifications that you will encounter or need to model. So we didn't discuss about those ones, but it's well possible, right? If you think about your average media player, you can control in the notifications or in the taskbar whether you want to continue play or not, Spotify style or something like this. Or I think VLC supports that as well, I believe. Anyway, if you use that on mobile. So that's one pathway. And what ties everything together, I think all the components, including, of course, specifically notifications, was the concept of intents, right? So we have the different application components and notifications, and every time you want to send information or pass information between those, you need intents, right? So, yesterday I did a brief gauging. I had the impression that you, of course, have an implicit understanding of intents because you use them, right, to start activities, services and other stuff, but you probably, I'm not sure, they haven't probably been discussed in greater depth. So the intent of this session was indeed then to discuss them in greater depth, right? You catch my drift here, so it wasn't without intent, by the way. So today we're going through two concepts because they're kind of related, right? We have intents on the one hand, of course, and broadcast receivers, which have another functionality in the system. Basically, whereas intents glue the system components together, broadcast receivers can be an app / and I say it with care, system-wide event notification mechanism, or event listener rather, or a callback if you like, right? So it listens to a wide range of events. Unfortunately, nowadays they're not as powerful anymore as they used to be. We get to that later as to why that is the case. But they're, I really like them because you can really have reasonably complex interaction between system-level activities and your app, for example. So it's worthwhile using them for your own purpose. But we discuss the common issues with those ones and show how you can possibly use them and avoid those problems. So intents. Well, of course, it's an indicator of intention. You got that already, right? It's basically like a message passed along. And well, the Google definition would be the intent itself, an intent object, is a passive data structure holding an abstract description of an operation that is to be performed, right? So it basically says, I want to do that, right? Eventually, when I send my intent off, right? And that's really modeled, it's certainly inspired by the agent metaphor in multi-agent systems on, where you think about software concepts as autonomous entities, right? So where the software components, let's say your back-end, front-end, or your toolbar and your GUI and so on, are individual components that just need to interact. The advantage is that you have high level of modularity, and you can potentially integrate create complex applications by arbitrarily linking different objects. So this idea of loose coupling and high levels of modularity is kind of quite visible in this concept, and that's why it's really likable, really nice. In fact, in early 2000s we did a bit of research on that one. How could we use intents more generically for communication across the entire Android ecosystem, especially at that time where it was a bit more loosely defined, or wider. The usefulness was a bit wider than it is nowadays for mostly security reasons. Anyway, so when we talk about intents or the way they use them, there's two use cases, right? One is the explicit one, that is generally some sort of targeted invocation. So when you have activity 1, you want to start activity 2, right? So and then from there on activity 3 and so on, you can clearly explicitly indicate which activity you actually want to invoke, right? So very clear. Right? So that's probably the cleanest and simplest use of intents, and of course the fastest one, because the resolution mechanism doesn't have much to do really. It's just figuring out a instance, or rather identifying the target activity and instantiating it. So that's the possible use case. And the implicit intent is kind of the counterpart, where, well, you actually don't really know what will be invoked. What you do is rather you tell the system what you want to do, generally specified in the form of an action, right? So I want to view something. Okay, and what do you want to do? Well, I pass you that data along, this payload along. And it happens to be a URI, and you probably get here the hint, the variable name, website, or whatever else. It is some sort of URI, right? So I want to view that URI, start any activity that can facilitate this request, right? So that's when Android comes up, and well, or not potentially, and asks you, okay, which activity do you want to start for that, or which app do you want to start for that purpose? And this is a classic one. What do you think it would probably start? Browser, right? So classic. So you want to view something, and you have some sort of URI data, and that's classical browser functionality. We'll see some other examples later, but you get the idea. So it's really nice way of abstractly defining what you want to do, and also means you don't need to know the entire app ecosystem, right? If you really don't want to be bothered knowing which particular media player the system has installed, which would imply that you need to address it explicitly, you can just say, play that file or whatever else, and then the system deals with this, or tells the user, hey, yeah, actually you can't do anything because you don't have a media player. Well, unrealistic, but possible. And that's similar as functionality we know, for example, from Windows for a long time already, right? So that we have applications for different purposes that the user has to select. So it's really nice for compartmentalizing your tasks as well, and allowing a runtime integration, because you never know how your app then interacts with the existing ecosystem that is installed on a given phone, right? So pretty cool in a way, I think. I like the idea quite a lot in terms of the abstraction. So that's the execution pattern. I just found this schema which nicely highlights it, but it also, of course, highlights the challenges there, right? We have an explicit execution. For example, if activity 1 is executing activity 3, that would be quite straightforward. The intent resolution mechanism doesn't really have much to do in this case. Whereas if we have more implicit requests, such as send a new email, or good luck, then it's up to the user, of course, or potentially not, if there's only one email client, to actually decide which one to open and actually prepare for sending an email. Right? So, but you see that, of course, with this comes a lot of power potentially, right? So you can just start, potentially writing emails, of course, and aspects like this. For this purpose, it feeds back, of course, into the permission system, in the sense that which permissions you have that allow you to actually perform a particular task, right? So let's look at intents briefly, a bit more in greater detail. So intents generally consist of those components, right? So you can set those. So we have the action, that we just saw before, action view, and so on. Just give you some overview of the actions that are actually existing to see what's in the system. There are default actions. You can, of course, specify further ones if you wanted to, because you have the freedom to consume actions yourself. If you register a component that supports actions, a particular new action, that's fine, but you must be kind of certain that you're probably the only one that uses this or supports this particular action. And so standard actions of classical and their pairing with data is of course quite brilliant. Are those ones here. So for example, we have action view, and then a pointer to content contacts people. If you recall from the storage lecture or the persistence lecture last week, this is an example URI that addresses a content provider, right, as one of the other explication components for data storage and persistence, and specifically the one relevant for showing or for managing context, basically your context manager, right? So, and then, well, show me the first entry from there, right? So view the first entry in the context manager would basically be the outcome of this request. Similarly here, you would have display a telephone number or prepare a dialer basically with telephone number, but don't press the button yet, right? Basically just bring up the pre-filled field, so it's quite straightforward. Whereas, for example, if you want to actually dial something, you can actually address a specific context and say, display the phone dialer and dial. The actual dialing itself is luckily suppressed, right? So you still need to have some sort of user interaction. But in principle, you can be quite explicit about this and at least minimize the user interaction. So there's no need of copying around stuff. So categories we get to in a second. Yeah, good, okay. So those are some of the main, the typical kind of actions that you'll find. So in addition to that, we saw already that we, of course, also have data, right? So kind of it's a bit lengthy here. So it's kind of target component specific data, right? So it really boils down to the combination of action and the type of the data structure will tell me what component is actually opened, right? If it's, for example, a telephone number, well, most likely it would be dialer ending up with this. If it's, however, a URL, then the system will start the system browser and so on, right? And again, as we saw before, if it's a content receiver URI, which is also URI, right? Content, so the protocol is content : / which in Android resolves to content providers, then you would likewise get access to content provider. So it's quite relevant. So so categories is basically a characterization of the target activity more rigidly. So what kind of features should the target activity support? Should it just be able to view, for example, URLs, or do you also want to do something else? Do you need to have browsable capabilities? Would you want to be able to browse onwards from there on? So you can kind of characterize the application more widely. So if the system has the choice between just a blunt viewer of something as opposed to a browser, then it probably would go for the browser if you specify the category more explicitly. Yeah. So that's the purpose of categories explicitly here, and I'll just highlight some common categories as well. In fact, yeah. Does it resolve anchors, please? Standard categories, there you go. So, so that's a further clarification of the intent, and you basically add a category. So default is kind of a default category, is the catch-all kind of thing. We'll see that in a second later. Is it browsable? Can you tap? Is it on the launcher? So meaning, is the application actually visible on your in your launcher? Can you actually manually invoke it? Some activities may not be visible in a launcher, but will be installed. Some services, right? So you can install them on the device, but you don't have a representation in the menu. And the category launcher would be a determinant as to whether that app needs to be visible, or at least the starter for it needs to be visible. So that's, I think, Android auto specific, and so on. So there's various other ones which you, of course, would need to have a check what they actually imply. Okay, so it seems like this requires further information about the characterization of the package with respect to info and so on. So categories there as well. the intent, oh well, that's, I should stop using the term. The motivation, I guess, for this is to narrow down as much as possible in an open, you know, application landscape on a given device to what you intend you actually want, also what activity you actually want to resolve. In that light, it's quite sensible to have it. I hardly see the category used for that purpose, at least if you ad hoc calling intents, but we'll see that later with more details. So targets. In terms of typical URI types, I'll show you a few example maps. So, so for example, URI types, there are various ones, right? There's geo with latitude, longitude. If you want to pass, for example, coordinates along, we of course have a. So that's a funny one here, actually. Call a car. So it's actually integrated into Android, so you can actually call a taxi using the action reserve taxi reservation, right? No data attached, nothing else, which is a bit of a pity, right? You could expect them to at least specify current location and intended location, but you know that's the kind of ad hoc thing that you probably put in if you want to attract, you know, or give the impression that something is really hot in a way. Open document, for example, but again, UIs. You saw examples earlier that, for example, the telephone number, websites, and the like, and we'll see more of those in a second. Unfortunately, I don't see the menu right now. It was quite shows. Yeah. Anyway, so we'll see more later. So, in addition, so we have those in action, data, and category to characterize the target application more explicitly, right? So, and then for anything else that we can't express using those three components. We have extras mostly, and extras, think about it from a structure point of view, like a key value pairs, like bundles or shared preferences in a way, right? So they're not the same, but the structure is the same. That you have a key value relationship there, and you can pretty much put anything in there that you need, like payload that you want to carry over, right? Embed another intent could be an example, or you know, put binary information in there, or anything that your target application that you develop probably needs that isn't captured by the other ones here, right? So if you, yeah, so an example could be in, I'm not sure if they do it still, I need to have a look, I have an example later, but for example, if you want to have richer context information for emails, so you want to start writing an email to a particular individual, you could, for example, encode the extra, you know, body information or so on in here, aspects that are not directly supported by the email intent, as we'll see, and then actually use them in the target application. So it's kind of up to you kind of thing, plus convention, because sometimes if you find, you saw the general use of common intents for different purposes, like calling a taxi, they generally specify explicitly what they expect in the different fields to be, right? So you kind of need to read the spec to understand what's going on, which is a bit of a pity. So it feels like a lot of custom fields that are introduced by for particular applications. But so can you, right? So if you have a new application that has a particular set of characteristics and expects certain information, for example, as payload in the extras, you can also specify this in your own intent. So the whole thing, while standardized around the common intents provided, supported by Android, you can extend it, all of that, right? So that's really neat and nice. Apart from the extras, the last thing that intents come with, or at least optionally allow you to provide, are flags. And they're basically meta information for processing, right? So generally, what is the expected target runtime behavior of the target component? So they don't carry payload, but they tell the system how the target component has to behave. So a few examples for this category to share some intuitions. There we go. So it's all like flag activity kind of thing. So flag activity, show previous activity on top, clear top activity. If it's called yeah, replace a pending receiver. So for example, if you have a pending intent, we saw that thing yesterday, and you have a new intent as part of this intent here coming up, it's supposed to replace that one. Yeah, so basically quite a bit of meta information, runtime processing information that can be specified using this one. This one is interesting, flag debug log resolution. So if you run with this flag, you can actually retrace the resolution of intents, basically how the intent resolution works in the backend in the log. So you just check logcat and you see how an intent is actually resolved and finds its target application component. So that's good for debugging that stuff. So it wouldn't hurt to know about that one as a flag. We can just append it as flag debug log, and then you get an understanding of what's happening. Yeah, so that's roughly what the intent is about, right? So having a very abstract specification. I'll run through a few mini examples, if that's helpful, to just give an intuition of how hopefully simple their use actually is. So I have a mini activity here with a few random buttons, and I evidently need to bind still. So should have done that before, so there you go. And then sets on-click listener, and then you on-click listener, and then we want to do something. So let's implement do something. So in here we can kind of mess around a bit. Let's specify some candidate data types. If we, for example, have a website, it would be something like that, right? So example.com org standard page. The thing about the resolution for URIs, it expects explicitly specification of the protocol, right? HTTPS or HTTP. Otherwise, the resolution will not work. It will not pick up. Even if you have dub, that's not part of the protocol specification. It's the host specification, and that will not resolve, at least in my experience. I'm not sure. It may actually depend on different versions, but generally it won't. So the expectation of the protocol, like here, telephone, for example.
Can you tell it port instead of protocol?
Again, sorry?
Can you say port 80 or port 443 instead of HTTP or HTTPS?
Let's try that later. That's a good idea. I doubt it, but that is so it would imply, because the port specification. Let me think. No, but the port specification is secondary to the protocol specification, right? It says HTTP on port 443 or on port 8080, right? So the port itself still doesn't tell me what protocol I speak, right?
Are they reserved under 1000?
Of course, you could assume that if there's reserved ports, right, so that the system resolves. I simply don't know. I haven't thought about this. We'll try it out. I think the idea is good. Yeah, let's do that in a second. And let's use the geo coordinate as well for the sake of it. So what do we do? Geo is the protocol here. So and then we need to have some sort of. How many decimal places do you need? Quite a bit. And then 70. I don't think to specify them, but that's the resolution that is supported. Cool. So that would be classical data types. Let's play safe for a moment before we break the system. So and then you basically just specify an intent. Intent. And of course I need to import this thing. And the first thing you need to specify is, or if the signature is not shown here, that's a bit of a pity, but so you specify the action you want to do, and since we're relying on standard actions, we resolve them by constants. You can of course specify your own constants for that purpose if you think that is sensible. But I think it's a good sensible choice to start with what you actually have. So we have send to, answer, and so. But standard one would be to say view, right? So let's start with this one. So view something, and when we pass information along, the information needs to be, in this case, needs to be clear that is a URI. So we're passing it from a string. Let's use the website for now. Oh yeah, import, and basically just start an activity. So one thing which I find is a pity, quite personally, is that you nevertheless explicitly need to specify what target what type of target component you expect the intent to be processed by, right? It would be really cool if you could just specify an intent and say, I don't care if it's consumed by an activity, a service, or a content provider, right? Because the protocol should be enough, right? Meaning the data specification in the form of a protocol should probably be enough to figure those things out, right? So it's the action specification could be sufficient to do that. But no, it still requires or it's basically I guess for the sake of efficiency, it requires us to explicitly specify the target activity that's associated with this. Oh no, what do we have? So am I missing the fact that it's actually so we probably need to specify that this activity has to be on the launcher. Now to cheat a bit and see the syntax for that, because classical we'll wake him up later. So right. Right. So what I did here just now, because I hacked the UI in there because I didn't want to create a new UI, so I was that was probably a bit cheating. But what I added here was an intent filter, and that's important for the specification. Every time you create a new activity and it comes with a layout, right, associated with this, it generally automatically injects a subtag intent filter to your activity and specifies first of all that this activity that or main activity that you've created is first of all the procedure entry point, basically the main class, right? And the second one that should appear on your launcher, as I mentioned before, should be available, you know, in the menu item for doing stuff with this, I guess. So, and that's the kind of thing that's that I was missing. So, all right, this resolution will still not work. Why is it broken? Something is broken. Hang on. What did I oversee? Does anyone see it? I don't think that will be resolved. So let's say app theme. The app theme needs to come before the intent filter, right? So, but the activity is terminated down here. What the heck? This thing doesn't work with me. Oh, there you go. Yeah. So intent filter. And we put that stuff here. Don't terminate here. That looks better, right? So, all right. So just for clarification, so we have, of course, as you know, you talked about the manifest before, right? So we have an application. The application consists of components, the 4 ones that we know. One of them here is an activity, and then it has a nested intent filter that basically says, you know, where should that thing appear and what its main functionality is. So that's settled. So that's that one. Cool, let's start this thing. Hopefully we are not, okay, it recognizes that there's now a main execution point associated with this. And let's see if my AVD comes up. Usually takes a tad. Ah, there you go. So once it's up, we'll just briefly check what's happening, and then we try out the protocol variation. Cool. So a button here, I think I bound it to the first button, and that's basically what's supposed to happen, that it's opening something. Yeah, so indeed it opens the URL. So that kind of works, right? So and the neat part is simply we can, well, let's modify the URL first. So go down that rabbit hole. So we take port 80 or 443? 80. Let's see what's happening. Nothing happens. So if we look at logcat, we probably get, that's a general sense of a pathway in those cases. So actually figure out, okay, so I'm not used to having logcat that large, admittedly, so it's a bit, there you go, there's something went wrong. It's quite explicit. No activity found to handle intent, right? The resolution failed, and the data that we provided was just the URL in port 80. So it doesn't work. It still requires the protocol, which is the main means of resolution. So this answered that one, this mystery. So we would need to use the conventional HTTPS, and that would certainly work. Try that as well. Of course it will work, because then it's part of the protocol specification to deal with multiple ports. But for the sake of completeness, just do it. Right, so it picks up for port 80, so that's unproblematic. Yeah, so it complains because it's not SSL encrypted, but that's of course specific to the fact that we use port 80. So if we use, for example, telephone number, I'm not sure if we need to change the action for that particular purpose, but let's just do that while it's resolving. Probably takes a while. Let's do the same with the geo thing. So, and something else is bound to the other button. In the meantime, I guess we have this one. So if we now press here, let's see, what do we get? Does it break? Yeah, it actually shows what it's supposed to do. So it shows the dialer with the pre-filled telephone number, basically, right? So that's as simple as it is. So just by changing the data, the protocol in the payload, you have a different outcome because it dynamically resolves the different components. So that would be one example for this. Let's see if the geo thing works as well. That really depends on the device to some extent, and as to whether you have the Google apps installed. That makes a huge difference whether resolution works. So I think I've tied this to the second button, and here of course we have Google Maps. So because it's a stock device, and let's see if it actually does the resolution to some extent. Okay. Let's see if we more. Geos protocol, so it picked that up. That for sure worked. It actually picked it up. Sorry. It's just the resolution is too high. I don't see anything. That's it. So I am suspicion is I'm somewhere in India. Yeah. All right. Cool. It kind of actually works. So yeah. So that's the idea, right? So you provide the geo coordinate, and we use the application that allows you to view geo coordinates, of course, to display it. If you write your own app that consumes the geo protocol, data associated with this, so latitude, longitude, or for that matter, any of the formats specified in the Google specification here. We had it in common intents. Then you can of course have it resolved to your own activity, right? So that's quite neat actually. So if we find this timer, let's find geo. There you go. So those are the supported specifications. So for example, you can also be explicit and have something from a query such as your street address, right? So you can actually enter your home address and see what comes out in the end, right? So, or be super explicit, be about longitude and latitude in this respect. So it's quite nice, the flexibility that you have. So it's super important for you, of course, to know the intent structure. And that's the only thing, well, if you want to use standard intents anyway. And the only way of finding it out, again, is the developer specification under guide components and then intents common. I will also link this in the slide set. In fact, the links are all in the slide set. So if you want to retrace that and use it for your own purpose, that would be the way to go. Quite straightforward. And usually there are also snippets of how you implement them briefly. Yes. So yeah. So that would be one way of going. Here, interesting. Yeah. So we get to intent filters in a second. Cool. That was basically just a few pointers of how simple you can write generic intents for quite flexible use, and start specific components. Again, you need to be specific about the components you're trying to start. So the complement of intents, we need to have a mechanism that allows you as application developers to specify, well, my application can consume the following intents, right? So, and the only way of doing this is by using so-called intent filters. So they're kind of the counterpart, right? So intents for resolution, intent filters for specifying allowing matching against your application as well. So in the context of content providers, we talked about something similar. It was the content resolver, and that would allow you to resolve a specific content provider based on its data characteristics as well. So intent filters. So they're quite generic. You saw one just very now, right? So you use them for any activity to specify whether it's the main activity and where it should appear and stuff like that. But of course, the specification can be much richer. And you can specify the action, the category, and the data that you're expecting explicitly here. So action, of course, is what your application is supposedly doing. Browsing something, editing something, or just viewing something. Which category it falls under, and the data that it actually consumes. The extras and the flags are not specified in the intent filter because they are runtime relevant. So extras are specific to your activity. The intent filter doesn't care what specific extras are contained in an intent, right? They're just payload that you kind of need to know about if you want to interact with this activity. And my intuitive suspicion is that the resolution would be too expensive. It would, if it was going through all extras and match those as well. Please recall that again, it's a key value structure, so it would be quite expensive to actually match all that one. And similar to the flags, they're just relevant at runtime, right? In specifying the behavior. So only those three components need to be specified. If you want to be clear that you only, if you want to ensure that only the correct requests match your application, you of course are going to be more explicit, but it also implies that it may be harder to resolve to your application, right? So because in the particular activity will only be resolved if all the individual fields match, right? It's not enough for just action and data to match, you also need to match category. Yeah. But on the other hand, if you just want to get out of it and only deal with data largely and the action, you can use the default category, which is mandatory to be specified, and it basically catches everything or matches everything. So that's a very generic way of dealing with this. But if you want to be clear that your application has certain features, for example, the ability to edit in principle, the ability to browse, you can indicate this here as well. And last but not least, you can also link multiple intent filters with a particular activity or application component, which makes it flexible because you are, can consume different kind of requests. That's the key idea. So that's kind of the counterpart to what the intent would actually do in the in the application. So here on the common intent website by Google, you see generally every time they indicate or describe a standard intent that is supported by the system, they generally also have a snippet that highlights here in Kotlin or Java how we actually deal with the intent in practice, so a small snippet. Interesting thing here is something I should have done as well actually, is to check that the activity that is associated with the intent, meaning here the specification of action and data, will actually resolve, right? Else you will actually, see the experience that you just saw before, where we played around with the port number, where I should have technically just checked whether there is an application that resolves it and gracefully, deal with this or not. But in that case, I didn't, so it just throws an exception and exits, and no one has any clue what's happening. Right? So that's the way of checking whether an intent actually resolves before actually starting the corresponding component. So, but of course, along with the intent comes here the intent filter, also specified here. So if your application is supposed to be consuming geolocation information, well, it needs to support the action view. A data of the type geo, so you only see the scheme, right? The protocol schema specified, nothing else specific about the payload. It just will blindly resolve based on string resolution whether you actually support the particular protocol here, geo, and then leaves it up to your application to deal with the actual payload. And of course, the category in this case is just default category, right? So. And the pattern is always the same for other ones. So for example, if you want to play a music file or video in this example, you need to use action view and provide some UI scheme that points to where the resource sits that you want to go and play. Is it a file in a file system? Is it provided by a content provider? Or is it retrieved via the network, via HTTP in this example? And also what the data type is, right? So what kind of data are we dealing with, which format? Which is also relevant to resolve the corresponding activity. So and that would be how the correspond. So that's of course how the intent would look like. So you're setting certain data type, the intent, action, and so on, and the resolution bit. And the intent filter would, in addition to the action and the category, have some information about the data, right? So first of all, it's audio data, and more specifically, which type of audio data, so it can match the corresponding activity, right? So, and here you see that it makes sense that it kind of matches all fields, not just a subset of it, or probabilistically matching some fields and see how it goes, because it doesn't really help if you just resolve to an audio activity in this particular example, but you actually need to resolve to one that supports the OGG format, for example, right? So playing high quality music. So, and on it goes. So the intents can be arbitrarily simple or reasonably complex in terms of what they support and what they require. And here's a good example of an intent that requires a specification of extras. Note that the extras are not found somewhere in the intent filter at all. It just said, well, you need to be able playing media from a search and, well, have a default category. So it's super unspecific as to what will actually play the media. But here you find that there is the need to specify more information about, for example, artist and query, blah, 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 and so on, as part of this intent structure for it to resolve to system, I don't know which media player will respond to it, but to some sort of system activity in this particular case, right? So, and if you're specifying your own intent, you also need to be explicit about what you expect in terms of the necessary elements here. So, for example, if you create a node, there's the expectation that you have an explicit indication of the subject and the text of the node that you're going to create, right, in the extras before you resolve the activity. Whereas the creation of the node is basically very straightforward Android actions, and it's generic with respect to the data type it consumes. So, yeah. I think those examples give you a good kind of impression of how it basically works, right? Quite straightforward in that respect. Cool. Before I continue, I think that makes for a good break right now. We have shortly past 11. So let's say at 11:15 we continue now. Talk about broadcast receivers and how they fit into the bigger picture.